Hello friends, I welcome you to tonight's edition of Bedtime Stories for Grown-Ups. If you enjoy this reading, I would encourage you to subscribe, so you will be notified when a new bedtime story is ready for you. And now, it is time to unwind. Find yourself a place where you can relax. Once you have settled in and made yourself comfortable, take a deep breath. The tensions of the day are melting away. Your day has come to an end. The only thing left for you to do now is to listen to these stories and fall asleep. And so we begin. The Setness of Theodosia. When Theodosia Ford married Wesley Brook, after a courtship of 3 years, everybody concerned was satisfied. There was nothing particularly romantic in either the courtship or marriage. Wesley was a steady, well-meaning, rather slow fellow, comfortably off. He was not at all handsome, but Theodosia was a very pretty girl with the milky coloring of an auburn blonde and large china blue eyes. She looked mild and Madonna-like, and known to be sweet-tempered. Wesley's older brother, Irvin Brook, had married a woman who kept him in hot water all the time. So Heatherton folks said. But they thought there was no fear of that with Wesley and Theodosia. They would get along together all right. Only old Jim Parmalee shook his head and said, they might, and then again they mightn't. He knew the stock they came off, and it was a kind you could never predict about. Wesley and Theodosia were third cousins. This meant that old Henry Ford had been the great-great-grandfather of them both. Jim Parmalee, who was 90, had been a small boy when its remote ancestor was still alive. I mind him well, said old Jim on the morning of Theodosia's wedding day. There was a little group about the blacksmith's forge. Old Jim was in the center. He was a fat, twinkling-eyed old man, fresh and ruddy in spite of his 90 years. And, he went on, he was about the saddest man you'd ever see or want to see. When old Henry Ford made up his mind on any point, a cyclone couldn't turn him a hair's breadth. No, nor an earthquake neither. Didn't matter a mite how much he suffered for it. He'd stick to it if it broke his heart. There was always some story or other going around about old Henry's sadness. The family weren't quite so bad, only Tom. He was Dosia's great-grandfather, and a regular chip of the old block. Since then, it's cropped out now, and again all through the different branches of the family. I mistrust if Dosia hasn't got a spice of it, and Wisbrook too, but maybe not. Old Jim was the only croaker. Wesley and Theodosia were married in the golden prime of the Indian summer, and settled down on their snug little farm. Dosia was a beautiful bride, and Wesley's pride in her was amusingly apparent. He thought nothing too good for her, the Heatherton people said. It was a sight to make an old heart young to see him march up the aisle of the church on Sunday in all the glossy splendor of his wedding suit, his curly black head held high, and his round boyish face shining with happiness, stopping and turning proudly at his pew to show Theodosia in. They always sat alone together in the big pew, and Alma Spencer, who sat behind them, declared that they held each other's hands all through the service. This lasted until spring. Then came a sensation and scandal. such as decorous Heatherton had not known since the time Isaac Allen got drunk at Centerville Fair. One evening in the early April, Wesley came home from the store at the corner, where he had lingered to talk over politics and farming methods with his cronies. This evening he was later than usual, and Theodosia had his supper kept warm for him. She met him on the porch and kissed him. He kissed her in return, and held her to him for a minute. With her bright head on his shoulder, the frogs were singing down in the South Meadow swamp, and there was a splendor of silvery moonrise over the wooded Heatherton hills. Theodosia always remembered that moment. When they went in, Wesley, full of excitement, began to talk of what he had heard at the store. Ogden Green and Tom Carey were going to sell out and go to Manitoba. There were better chances for a man out there, he said. In Heatherton he might slave all his life and never make more than a bare living. Out west he might make a fortune. Wesley talked on in this strain for some time, rehashing all the arguments he had heard Green and Carey use. He had always been rather disposed to grumble at his limited chances in Heatherton, and now the great West seemed to stretch before him, full of alluring prospects and visions. Ogden and Tom wanted him to go too, he said. He had half a notion to. Heatherton was a stick-in-the-mud sort of place anyhow. "What say, Dosia?" He looked across the table at her, his eyes bright and questioning. Theodosia had listened in silence, as she poured his tea and passed him her hot, flaky biscuits. There was a little perpendicular wrinkle between her straight eyebrows. "I think Ogden and Tom are fools," she said crisply. "They have good farms here. What do they want to go west for? Or you either. Don't get silly notions in your head, Wes." Wes flushed. "Wouldn't you go with me, Dosia?" he said, trying to speak lightly. "No, I wouldn't," said Theodosia, in her calm, sweet voice. Her face was serene, but the little wrinkle had grown deeper. Old Jim Parmalee would have known what it meant. He had seen the same expression on old Henry Ford's face many a time. Wesley laughed good-humoredly, as if at a child. His heart was suddenly set on going west, and he was sure he could soon bring Theodosia around. He did not say anything more about it just then. Wesley thought he knew how to manage women. When he broached the subject again 2 days later, Theodosia told him plainly that it was no use. She would never consent to leave Heatherton and all her friends and go out to the prairies. The idea was just rank foolishness, and he would soon see that himself. All this Theodosia said calmly and sweetly, without any trace of temper or irritation. Wesley still believed that he could persuade her, and he tried perseveringly for a fortnight. By the end of that time he discovered that Theodosia was not a great-great-granddaughter of old Henry Ford for nothing. Not that Theodosia ever got angry, neither did she laugh at him. She met his arguments and pleadings seriously enough, but she never wavered. "If you go to Manitoba, Wes, you'll go alone," she said. "I'll never go, so there is no use in any more talking." Wesley was a descendant of old Henry Ford, too. Theodosia's unexpected opposition aroused all the latent stubbornness of his nature. He went over to Centerville oftener, and kept his blood at fever heat, talking to Green and Carey, who wanted him to go with them and spared no pains at inducement. The matter was gossiped about in Heatherton, of course. People knew that Wesley Brook had caught the Western fever and wanted to sell out and go to Manitoba, while Theodosia was opposed to it. They thought Dosia would have to give in the end, but said it was a pity Wes Brook couldn't be contented to stay where he was well off. Theodosia's family naturally sided with her and tried to dissuade Wesley, but he was mastered by that resentful irritation roused in a man by opposition where he thinks he should be master, which will drive him into any cause. One day he told Theodosia that he was going. She was working her butter in her little snowy clean dairy under the great willows by the well. Wesley was standing in the doorway, his stout, broad-shouldered figure filling up the sunlit space. He was frowning and sullen. "I'm going west in 2 weeks' time with the boys, Dosia," he said stubbornly. "You can come with me or stay here, just exactly as you please, but I'm going." Theodosia went on spatting her balls of golden butter on the print in silence. She was looking very neat and pretty in her big white apron, her sleeves rolled up high above her plump, dimpled elbows, and her ruddy hair curling about her face and her white throat. She looked as pliable as her butter. Her silence angered her husband. He shuffled impatiently. "Well, what have you to say, Dosia?" "Nothing," said Theodosia. "If you have made up your mind to go, go you will, I suppose. But I will not. There is no use in talking. We've been over the ground often enough, Wes. The matter is settled." Up to that moment, Wesley had always believed that his wife would yield at last, when she saw that he was determined. Now he realized that she never would. Under that exterior of milky, dimpled flesh and calm blue eyes was all the iron will of old, dead, and forgotten Henry Ford. This mildest and meekest of girls and wives was not to be moved a hair's breadth by all argument or entreaty, or insistence on her husband's rights. A great sudden anger came over the man. He lifted his hand, and for one moment it seemed to Theodosia as if he meant to strike her. Then he dropped it with the first oath that had ever crossed his lips. "You listen to me," he said thickly. "If you won't go with me, I'll never come back here. Never. When you want to do your duty as a wife, you can come back to me, but I'll never come back." He turned on his heel and strode away. Theodosia kept on spatting her butter. The little perpendicular wrinkle had come between her brows again. At that moment, an odd, almost uncanny resemblance to the old portrait of her great-great-grandfather, which hung on the parlor wall at home, came out on her girlish face. The fortnight passed by. Wesley was silent and sullen, never speaking to his wife when he could avoid it. Theodosia was as sweet and serene as ever. She made an extra supply of shirts and socks for him, put up his lunch basket, and packed his trunk carefully, but she never spoke of his journey. He did not sell his farm. Irvin Brook rented it. Theodosia was to live in the house. The business arrangements were simple, and soon concluded. Heatherton folks gossiped a great deal. They all condemned Theodosia. Even her own people sided against her now. They hated to be mixed up in a local scandal. And since Wes was bound to go, they told Theodosia that it was her duty to go with him, no matter how much she disliked it. It would be disgraceful not to. They might as well have talked to the four winds. Theodosia was immovable. They coaxed and argued and blamed. It all came to the same thing. Even those of them who could be set enough themselves on occasion could not understand Theodosia, who had always been so tractable. They finally gave up, as Wesley had done, baffled. Time would bring her to her senses, they said. You just had to leave that still, stubborn kind alone. On the morning of Wes's departure, Theodosia arose at sunrise and prepared a tempting breakfast. Irvin Brooke's oldest son, Stanley, who was to drive Wesley to the station, came over early with his express wagon. Wesley's trunk, corded and labeled, stood on the back platform. The breakfast was a very silent meal. When it was over, Wesley put on his hat and overcoat and went to the door, around which Theodosia's morning glory vines were beginning to twine. The sun was not yet above the trees, and the long shadows lay on the dewy grass. The red leaves were flickering on the old maples that grew along the fence between the yard and the clover field beyond. The skies were all pearly blue, clean swept of clouds. From the little farmhouse the green meadows sloped down to the valley, where blue haze wound in and out like a glistening ribbon. Theodosia went out and stood looking inscrutably on, while Wesley and Irving hoisted the trunk into the wagon and tied it. Then Wesley came up to the porch steps and looked at her. "Dosia," he said a little huskily, "I said I wouldn't ask you to go again, but I will. Will you come with me yet?" "No," said Theodosia gently. He held out his hand. He did not offer to kiss her. "Goodbye, Dosia." "Goodbye, Wes." There was no tremor of an eyelash with her. Wesley smiled bitterly and turned away. When the wagon reached the end of the little lane, he turned and looked back for the last time. Through all the years that followed, he carried with him the picture of his wife, as he saw her then, standing amid the airy shadows and wavering golden lights of the morning, the wind blowing the skirt of her pale blue wrapper about her feet and ruffling the locks of her bright hair into a delicate golden cloud. Then the wagon disappeared around a curve in the road, and Theodosia turned and went back into her desolate home. For a time there was a great buzz of gossip over the affair. People wondered over it. Old Jim Parmalee understood better than the others. When he met Theodosia, he looked at her with a curious twinkle in his keen old eyes. "Looks as if a man could bend her any way he'd a mind to, doesn't she?" he said. "Looks is deceiving. It'll come out in her face by and by. She's too young yet, but it's there. It does seem unnatural to see a woman so stubborn. You kind of look for it more in a man." Wesley wrote a brief letter to Theodosia when he reached his destination. He said he was well and was looking about for the best place to settle. He liked the country fine. He was at a place called Red Butte and guessed he'd locate there. 2 weeks later, he wrote again. He had taken up a claim of 300 acres. Green and Carey had done the same. They were his nearest neighbors and were 3 miles away. He had knocked up a little shack, was learning to cook his own meals, and was very busy. He thought the country was a grand one, and the prospects good. Theodosia answered his letter and told him all the Heatherton news. She signed herself Theodosia Brook, but otherwise there was nothing in the letter to indicate that it was written by a wife to her husband. At the end of a year, Wesley wrote and once more asked her to go out to him. He was getting on well, and was sure she would like the place. It was a little rough, to be sure, but time would improve that. "Won't you let bygones be bygones, Dosia?" he wrote, "and come out to me. Do, my dear wife." Theodosia wrote back, refusing to go. She never got any reply, nor did she write again. People had given up talking about the matter, and asking Theodosia when she was going out to Wes. Heatherton had grown used to the chronic scandal within its decorous borders. Theodosia never spoke of her husband to anyone, and it was known that they did not correspond. She took her youngest sister to live with her. She had a garden and hens and a cow. The farm brought her enough to live on, and she was always busy. When 15 years had gone by, there were naturally some changes in Heatherton, sleepy and unprogressive as it was. Most of the old people were in the little hillside burying ground that fronted the sunrise. Old Jim Parmalee was there, with his recollections of 4 generations. Men and women who had been in their prime when Wesley went away were old now, and the children were grown up and married. Theodosia was 35, and was nothing like the slim, dimpled girl who had stood on the porch steps and watched her husband drive away that morning, 15 years ago. She was stout and comely. The auburn hair was darker and arched away from her face in smooth, shining waves, instead of the old-time curls. Her face was unlined and fresh-colored, but no woman could live in subjection to her own unbending will for so many years and not show it. Nobody looked at Theodosia now, would have found it hard to believe that a woman with such a determined, immovable face could stick to a course of conduct in defiance of circumstances. Wesley Brook was almost forgotten. People knew, through correspondence of Green and Carey, that he had prospered and grown rich. The curious old story had crystallized into accepted history. A life may go on without ripple or disturbance for so many years that it may seem to have settled into a lasting calm. Then a sudden wind of passion may sweep over it and leave behind a wake of tempestuous waters. Such a time came at last to Theodosia. One day in August, Mrs. Emery Merritt dropped in. Emery Merritt's sister was Ogden Green's wife, and the Merritts kept up an occasional correspondence with her. Hence, Cecilia Merritt always knew what was to be known about Wesley Brook, and always told Theodosia because she had never been expressly forbidden to do so. Today, she looked slightly excited. Secretly, she was wondering if the news she brought would have any effect whatever on Theodosia's impassive calm. "Do you know, Dosia, Wesley's real sick. In fact, Phoebe Green says they have very poor hopes of him. He was kind of ailing all the spring, it seems, and about a month ago he was took down with some kind of slow fever they have out there. Phoebe says they have a hired nurse from the nearest town and a good doctor, but she reckons he won't get over it. That fever goes awful hard with a man of his years." Cecilia Merritt, who was the fastest talker in Heatherton, had got this out before she was brought up by a queer sound, half gasp, half cry, from Theodosia. The latter looked as if someone had struck her a physical blow. "Mercy, Dosia, you ain't going to faint." "I didn't suppose you'd care. You never seem to care." "Did you say," asked Theodosia thickly, "that Wesley is sick, dying?" Well, that's what Phoebe said. She may be mistaken. Dosia Brook, you're a queer woman. I never could make you out, and I never expect to. I guess only the Lord who made you can translate you. Theodosia stood up. The sun was getting low, and the valley beneath them, ripening to harvest, was like a river of gold. She folded up her sewing with a steady hand. It's 5 o'clock, so I'll ask you to excuse me, Cecilia. I have a good deal to attend to. You can ask Emery if he'll drive me to the station in the morning. I'm going out to Wes. Well, for the land's sake, said Cecilia Merritt feebly, as she tied on her gingham sunbonnet. She got up and went home in a daze. Theodosia packed her trunk and worked all night, dry-eyed, with agony and fear tearing at her heart. The iron will had snapped at last, like a broken reed, and fierce self-condemnation seized on her. I've been a wicked woman, she moaned. A week from that day, Theodosia climbed down from the dusty stage that had brought her from the station over the prairies to the unpretentious little house where Wesley Brook lived. A young girl, so like what Ogden Green's wife had been 15 years before, that Theodosia involuntarily exclaimed, "Phoebe," came to the door. Beyond her, Theodosia saw the white-capped nurse. Her voice trembled. Does Wesley Brook live here?" she asked. The girl nodded. "Yes, but he is very ill at present. Nobody is allowed to see him." Theodosia put up her hand and loosened her bonnet strings as if they were choking her. She had been sick with the fear that Wesley would be dead before she got to him. The relief was almost overwhelming. "But I must see him," she cried hysterically. She, the calm, easy-going Dosia, hysterical. "I am his wife, and oh, if he had died before I got here." The nurse came forward. "In that case, I suppose you must," she conceded. "But he does not expect you. I must prepare him for the surprise." She turned to the door of a room opening off the kitchen, but Theodosia, who had hardly heard her, was before her. She was inside the room before the nurse could prevent her. Then she stood, afraid and trembling, her eyes searching the dim apartment hungrily. When they fell on the occupant of the bed, Theodosia started in bitter surprise. All unconsciously, she had been expecting to find Wesley as he had been when they parted. Could this gaunt, haggard creature, with the unkempt beard and prematurely grey hair, and the hollow, beseeching eyes, be the ruddy, boyish-faced husband of her youth? She gave a choking cry of pain and shame, and the sick man turned his head. Their eyes met. Amazement, incredulity, hope, dread, all flashed in succession over Wesley Brook's lined face. He raised himself feebly up. "Dosia," he murmured. Theodosia staggered across the room and fell on her knees by the bed. She clasped his head to her breast and kissed him again and again. "Oh, Wes, Wes, how can you forgive me? I've been a wicked, stubborn woman, and I've spoiled our lives. Forgive me." He held his thin, trembling arms around her and devoured her face with his eyes. "Dosia, when did you come? Did you know I was sick?" "Wes, I can't talk till you say you've forgiven me." "Oh, Dosia, you have just as much to forgive. We were both too set. I should have been more considerate." "Just say, 'I forgive you, Dosia,'" she entreated. "I forgive you, Dosia," he said gently. "And oh, it's so good to see you once more, darling. There hasn't been an hour since I left you that I haven't longed for your sweet face. If I thought you'd really cared, I'd have gone back. But I thought you didn't. It broke my heart. You did, though, didn't you?" "Oh, yes, yes, yes," she said, holding him more closely, with her tears falling. When the young doctor from Red Butte came that evening, he found a great improvement in his patient. Joy and happiness. Those world-old physicians had done what drugs and medicines had failed to do. "I'm going to get better, Doc," said Wesley. "My wife has come and she's going to stay. You didn't know I was married, did you? I'll tell you the story some day. I propose going back east. But Dosia says she'd rather stay here. I'm the happiest man in Red Butte, Doc." He squeezed Theodosia's hand, as he had used to do long ago in Heatherton Church, and Dosia smiled down at him. There were no dimples now, but her smile was very sweet. The ghostly figure of old Henry Ford, pointing down through the generations, had lost its power to brand with its malediction the life of these, his descendants. Wesley and Theodosia had joined hands with their long-lost happiness. The Way of Winning Anne. Jerome Irving had been courting Anne Stockard for 15 years. He had begun when she was 20, and he was 25. And now that Jerome was 40, and Anne, in a village where everybody knew everybody else's age, had to own to being 35, the courtship did not seem any nearer a climax than it had at the beginning. But that was not Jerome's fault, poor fellow. At the end of the first year, he had asked Anne to marry him, and Anne had refused. Jerome was disappointed, but he kept his head and kept on courting Anne just the same. That is, he went over to Essex Stockard's house every Saturday night and spent the evening. He walked home with Anne from prayer meeting and singing school and parties when she would let him, and ask her to go to all the concerts and socials and quilting frolics that came off. Anne never would go, of course, but Jerome faithfully gave her the chance. Old Essex rather favored Jerome's suit, for Anne was the plainest of his many daughters, and no other fellow seemed at all anxious to run Jerome off the track. But she took her own way with true Stockard firmness, and matters were allowed to drift on at the will of time or chance. 3 years later, Jerome tried his luck again, with precisely the same result, and after that he had asked Anne regularly once a year to marry him. And just as regularly Anne said no, a little more brusquely, and a little more decidedly every year. Now, in the mellowness of a 15-year-old courtship, Jerome did not mind it at all. He knew that everything comes to the man who has patience to wait. Time, of course, had not stood still with Anne and Jerome, or with the history of Deep Meadows. At the Stockard homestead, the changes had been many and marked. Every year or two there had been a wedding in the big brick farmhouse, and one of old Essex girls had been the bride each time. Julia and Grace and Celia, and Betty and Theodosia and Clementina Stockard were all married and gone. But Anne had never had another lover. There had to be an old maid in every big family, she said, and she was not going to marry Jerome Irving just for the sake of having Mrs. on her tombstone. Old Essex and his wife had been put away in the Deep Meadows burying ground. The broad, fertile Stockard acres passed into Anne's possession, She was a good businesswoman, and the farm continued to be the best in the district. She kept 2 hired men and a servant girl, and the 16-year-old of her oldest sister lived with her. There were few visitors at the Stockard place now, but Jerome dropped in every Saturday night with clockwork regularity and talked to Anne about her stock and advised her regarding the rotation of her crops and the setting out of her orchards. And at 10 o'clock he would take his hat and cane and tell Anne to be good to herself and go home. Anne had long since given up trying to discourage him. She even accepted attentions from him now that she had used to refuse. He always walked home with her from evening meetings and was her partner in the games at quilting parties. It was great fun for the young folks. Old Jerome and Anne were a standing joke in Deep Meadows. But the older people had ceased to expect anything to come of it, and laughed at Jerome, as she had always done, and would not have owned for the world that she could have missed him. Jerome was useful, she admitted, and a comfortable friend, and she would have liked him well enough if he would only omit that ridiculous yearly ceremony of proposal. It was Jerome's 40th birthday when Anne refused him again. He realized this as he went down the road in the moonlight, and doubt and dismay began to creep into his heart. Anne and he were both getting old. There was no disputing that fact. It was high time that he brought her to terms if he was ever going to. Jerome was an easygoing mortal and always took things placidly. But he did not mean to have all those 15 years of patient courting go for nothing. He had thought Anne would get tired of saying no sooner or later and say yes, if for no other reason than to have a change. But getting tired did not seem to run in the Stockard blood. She had said no that night just as coolly and decidedly and unsentimentally as she said it 15 years before. Jerome had the sensation of going around in a circle and never getting any further on. He made up his mind that something must be done. And just as he got to the brook that divides Deep Meadows West from Deep Meadows Central, an idea struck him. It was a good idea, and amused him. He laughed aloud and slapped his thigh, much to the amusement of the 2 boys who were sitting unnoticed on the railing of the bridge. "There's old Jerome going home from seeing Aunt Stockard," said one. "Wonder what on earth he's laughing at. Seems to me if I couldn't get a wife without hoeing a 15-year row, I'd give up trying." But then the speaker was a Hamilton, and the Hamiltons never had any perseverance. Jerome, although a well-to-do man, owning a good farm, had, so to speak, no home of his own. The old Irving homestead belonged to his older brother, who had a wife and family. Jerome lived with them and was so used to it, he didn't mind. At 40, a lover must not waste time. Jerome thought out the details that night, and next day he opened the campaign. But it was not until the evening after that Anne Stockard heard the news. It was her niece, Octavia, who told her. The latter had been having a chat up the lane with Sam Mitchell, and came in with a broad smile on her round, rosy face and a twinkle in her eyes. "I guess you've lost your beau this time, Aunt Anne. It looks as if he meant to take you at your word at last." "What on earth do you mean?" asked Anne, a little sharply. She was in the pantry counting eggs, and Octavia's interruption made her lose her count. "Now, I can't remember whether it was 6 or 7 dozen I said last. I shall have to count them all over again. I wish, Octavia, that you could think of something besides beaux all the time." Well, but listen, persisted Octavia wickedly. Jerome Irving was at the social at the Cherry Vale parsonage last night, and he had Harriet Warren there, took her there, and drove her home again. I don't believe it, cried Anne, before she thought. She dropped an egg into the basket so abruptly that the shell broke. Oh, it's true enough. Sam Mitchell told me. He was there and saw him. Sam says he looked quite beaming and was dressed to kill, and followed Harriet around like her shadow. I guess you won't have any more bother with him, Aunt Anne. In the process of picking the broken egg out of the whole ones, Anne had recovered her equanimity. She gave a careful little laugh. Well, it's to be hoped so. Goodness knows, it's time he tried somebody else. Go and change your dress for milking, Octavia, and don't spend quite so much time gossiping up the lane with Sam Mitchell. He always was a fetch and carry. Young girls oughtn't to be so pert. When the subdued Octavia had gone, Anne tossed the broken eggshell out of the pantry window viciously enough. There's no fool like an old fool. Jerome Irving always was an idiot. The idea of his going after Harriet Warren. He's old enough to be her father, and a Warren too. I've seen the time, and Irving wouldn't be seen on the same side of the road with a Warren. Well, anyhow, I don't care, and he needn't suppose I will. It will be a relief not to have him hanging around any longer. It might have been a relief, but Anne felt strangely lonely as she walked home alone from prayer meeting the next night. Jerome had not been there. The Warrens were Methodists, and Anne rightly guessed that he had gone to the Methodist prayer meeting at Cherry Vale. Dancing attendance on Harriet, she said to herself scornfully. When she got home, she looked at her face in the glass more critically than she had done for years. Anne Stockard at her best had never been pretty. When young, she had been called gawky. She was very tall, and her figure was lank and angular. She had a long, pale face and dusky hair. Her eyes had been good, a glimmering hazel, large and long-lashed. They were pretty yet, but the crow's feet about them were plainly visible. There were brackets around her mouth too, and her cheeks were hollow. Anne suddenly realized, as she had never realized before, that she had grown old, that her youth was left far behind. She was an old maid, and Harriet Warren was young and pretty. Anne's long, thin lips suddenly quivered. I declare I'm a worse fool than Jerome, she said angrily. When Saturday night came, Jerome did not. The corner of the big, old-fashioned porch, where he usually sat, looked bare and lonely. Anne was short with Octavia, and raged at herself. What did she care if Jerome Irving never came again? She could have married him years ago if she had wanted to. Everybody knew that. At sunset, she saw a buggy drive past her gate. Even at that distance, she recognized Harriet Warren's handsome, high-colored profile. It was Jerome's new buggy, and Jerome was driving. The wheel spokes flashed in the sunlight as they crept up the hill. Perhaps they dazzled Anne's eyes a little. At least, for that or some other reason, she dabbed her hand viciously over them as she turned sharply about and went upstairs. Octavia was practicing her music lesson in the parlor below, and singing in a sweet, shrill voice. The hired men were laughing and taking in the yard. Anne slammed down her window and banged her door, and then lay down on her bed. She said her head ached. The Deep Meadows people were amused and made joking remarks to Anne, which she had to take amiably because she had no excuse for resenting them. In reality, they stung her pride unendurably. When Jerome had gone, she realized that she had no other intimate friend and that she was a very lonely woman whom nobody cared about. One night, it was 3 weeks afterward, she met Jerome and Harriet squarely. She was walking to church with Octavia, and they were driving in the opposite direction. Jerome had his new buggy and crimson lap robe. His horse's coat shone like satin, and had rosettes of crimson on his bridle. Jerome was dressed extremely well and looked quite young, with his round, ruddy, clean-shaven face and clear blue eyes. Harriet was sitting primly and consciously by his side. She was a very handsome girl, with bold eyes, and was somewhat overdressed. She wore a big flowery hat and a white lace veil, and looked at Anne with a supercilious smile. Anne felt dowdy and old. She was very pale. Jerome lifted his hat and bowed pleasantly as they drove past. Suddenly Harriet laughed out. Anne did not look back, but her face crimsoned darkly. Was that girl laughing at her? She trembled with anger and a sharp, hurt feeling. When she got home that night, she sat a long while by her window. Jerome was gone, and he let Harriet Warren laugh at her, and he would never come back to her. Well, it did not matter, but she had been a fool. Only it had never occurred to her that Jerome could act so. If I thought he would, I mightn't have been so sharp with him, was as far as she would let herself go even in thought. When 4 weeks had elapsed, Jerome came over one Saturday night. He was fluttered and anxious, but hid it in a masterly manner. Anne was taken by surprise. She had not thought he would ever come again, and was off her guard. He had come around the porch corner abruptly as she stood there in the dusk, and she started very perceptibly. "Good evening, Anne," he said, easily and unblushingly. Anne choked up. She was very angry, or thought she was. Jerome appeared not to notice her lack of welcome. He sat coolly down in his old place. His heart was beating like a hammer, but Anne did not know that. "I suppose," she said cuttingly, "that you're on your way down to the bridge. It's almost a pity for you to waste time stopping here at all, any more than you have of late. No doubt Harriet will be expecting you." A gleam of satisfaction flashed over Jerome's face. He looked shrewdly at Anne, who was not looking at him, but was staring uncompromisingly out over the poppy beds. A jealous woman always gives herself away. If Anne had been indifferent, she would not have given him that slap in the face. "I don't know she will," he replied coolly. "I didn't say for sure whether I'd be down tonight or not. It's so long since I had a chat with you, and I thought I'd drop in for a spell. But of course, if I'm not wanted, I can go where I will be." Anne could not get back her self-control. Her nerves were all strung up, as she would have said. She had a feeling that she was right on the brink of a scene, but she could not help herself. "I guess it doesn't matter much what I want," she said stonily. "At any rate, it hasn't seemed that way lately. You don't care, of course. Oh, no. Harriet Warren is all you care about. Well, I wish you joy of her." Jerome looked puzzled, or pretended to. In reality, he was hugging himself with delight. "I don't understand you, Anne," he said hesitatingly. "You appear to be vexed about something." "I? Oh, no, I'm not, Mr. Irving. Of course, old friends don't count now." "Well, I've no doubt new ones will wear just as well." "If it's about my going to see Harriet," said Jerome easily, "I don't see as how it can matter much to you. Goodness knows, you took enough pains to show me you didn't want me. I don't blame you. A woman has a right to please herself, and a man ought to have the sense to take his answer and go. I hadn't, and that's where I made my mistake. I don't mean to pester you any more, but we can be real good friends, can't we? I'm sure I'm as much your friend as ever I was." Now, I hold that this speech of Jerome's, delivered in a cool, matter-of-fact tone, as of a man stating a case with dispassionate fairness, was a masterpiece. It was the last cleverly executed movement of the campaign. If it failed to effect a capitulation, he was a defeated man. But it did not fail. Anne had got to that point where an excited woman must go mad or cry. Anne cried. She sat flatly down on a chair and burst into tears. Jerome's hat went one way and his cane another. Jerome himself sprang across the intervening space and dropped into the chair beside Anne. He caught her hand in his and threw his arm boldly around her waist. "Goodness gracious, Anne, do you care after all? Tell me that." "I don't suppose it matters to you if I do," sobbed Anne. "It hasn't seemed to matter anyhow." "Anne, look here. Didn't I come after you for 15 years? It's you I always have wanted and want yet, if I can get you. I don't care a rap for Harriet Warren or anyone but you. Now that's the truth out, Anne." No doubt it was, and Anne was convinced of it. But she had to have her cry out on Jerome's shoulder, and it soothed her nerves wonderfully. Later on, Octavia, slipping noiselessly up the steps in the dusk, saw a sight that transfixed her with astonishment. When she recovered herself, she turned and fled wildly around the house, running bump into Sam Mitchell, who was coming across the yard from a twilight conference with the hired man. "Goodness, Tavy, what's the matter? You look as if you'd seen a ghost." Octavia leaned up against the wall in spasms of mirth. "Oh, Sam," she gasped. "Old Jerome Irving and Aunt Anne are sitting around there in the dark, on the front porch, and he has his arms around her, kissing her. And they never saw nor heard me, no more'n if they were deaf and blind." Sam gave a tremendous whistle, and then went off into a shout of laughter, whose echoes reached even to the gloom of the front porch and the ears of the lovers. But they did not know he was laughing at them, and would not have cared if they had. They were too happy for that. There was a wedding that fall, and Anne Stockard was the bride. When she was safely his, Jerome confessed all, and was graciously forgiven. "But it was kind of mean to Harriet," said Anne rebukingly, "to go with her and get her talked about and then drop her as you did. Don't you think so yourself, Jerome?" Her husband's eyes twinkled. "Well, hardly that. You see, Harriet's engaged to that Johnson fellow out west. 'Tain't generally known, but I knew it, and that's why I picked on her. I thought it probable that she'd be willing enough to flirt with me for a little diversion, even if I was old. Harriet's that sort of girl. And I made up my mind that if that didn't fetch it, nothing would. And I give up for good and all. But it did, didn't it, Anne?" "I should say so. It was horrid of you, Jerome, but I dare say it's just as well you did. Or I'd likely never have found out that I couldn't get along without you. I did feel dreadful. poor Octavia could tell you I was as cross as X. How did you come to think of it, Jerome? A fellow had to do something, said Jerome oracularly. And I'd have done almost anything to get you, Anne. That's a fact. And there it was, courting 15 years and nothing to show for it. I don't know, though, how I did come to think of it. Guess it was a sort of inspiration. Anyhow, I've got you. And that's what I set out to do in the beginning.